Glenn, thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to The World Deciphered.
Well, thanks for having me. Great pleasure.
Let's start from where do the nuclear weapons fit into the Russian military doctrine in general?
Well, I would say right now there's a period of great uncertainty and debate now in Russia. They're currently updating their nuclear strategy doctrine. And last week, the Kremlin strategist and well-known personality, Sergei Karganov, wrote an article in Kommersant that was basically nuclear saber rattling. But his audience was not in the West, it was in Russia. And so he was arguing that Russia's not doing enough. It needs to take a tougher position on its own nuclear doctrine, and it needs to wrap up its own internal assessments of the doctrine. And so this was quite surprising because he's always kind of very hawkish on these issues. And I think part of it was the timing of what is happening inside of Russia as Ukraine continues its ongoing operations inside of Russia in the Kursk region. And also not only the fact that Ukraine has started a second operation inside of Kursk, directly north of Sumy. And so what I think part of Ukraine's strategy is to show the West that there are no red lines for Russia, that showing basically that Russian threats of nuclear escalation are very hollow. It just seems that in the West that the elements of logic that you and I both have about Russian nuclear weapons strategy and this fear of escalation by the Biden administration, that anything they do in providing any type of assistance to Ukraine is going to meet this, escalatory response by Russia, which is shown again and again that it's very hollow. There's a lot of saber rattling and not a lot of action in terms of what Russia's saying. And so we become hostage of our fears.
You're saying that it's just rhetoric and you don't expect escalation from the Russian side. Did I understand you right?
Yes, that is correct. And that there's this area of vagueness in terms of what he's saying and then how we will respond. And Putin knows this. He knows that there's a concern among certain sections of the Biden cabinet, and including the president, that they have this inherent concern of World War III. And he's used it very effectively, and he's used it very effectively with some Republicans. So it's not just confined to one party. And it's a valid concern, but the facts don't really match in that direction. For example, if Putin was really ready to make a nuclear response in a statement, he could detonate a nuclear explosion at Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. There's been years of speculation that they've been wanting to resume nuclear testing again. And so one of those first targets would be to conduct a nuclear test in the Arctic. It'd be safe. It'd be a very effective way of showing the West that he's serious, but he didn't do it. And so, the things that he resorts to are very, in my opinion, very hollow and not backed up by facts and not backed up by the Russian military, which is increasingly unable to be able to respond to these types of asymmetric threats that Ukraine is posing to Russia.
How would you compare NATO's nuclear capabilities and those of Russia's? And where do you think this balance or power balance between NATO and Russia from the nuclear standpoint fits into this conversation that we're having now, whether Russia is likely to use nukes or not?
Well, NATO's nuclear capabilities are significant. I'm not an expert and can't get into kilotons and talk about delivery systems and all that. But what I would say is that the West and NATO have done a very dismal job even at reminding Russia that it has nuclear weapons. I mean, they won't even flaunt it in the way that Putin has. I mean, not by flaunt, but it'd be a subtle reminder to remind Putin that we have nuclear weapons as well. I mean, so two can play this game, and you don't have to, the statement doesn't have to be escalatory. It can be certainly very subtle. And certainly we've been demonstrated in the past that we were willing to do this.
Do you think this increases or decreases the risk of any sort of miscommunication, any sort of miscalculation about nuclear use?
Well, this is the people who support the view that anything we do could be viewed as escalatory. Is certainly that takes hold over how people how they respond. And so the United States, since the Vietnam War, has been has had this policy of where they try to avoid escalation, but yet they find themselves sinking deeper and deeper into taking actions that can be viewed as escalatory. And so, in other words, the Biden administration 6 months ago was not willing to give Ukraine F-16s, or a year ago. Now they're doing it. And so they constantly are backtracking in terms of how they respond, how they try to deal with this issue. And then they find themselves ending up doing the exact same thing that they were saying 6 months or a year ago that they weren't willing to do. Meanwhile, Ukraine keeps suffering every day. I mean, the point is that Russia can end this war. It's up to them to end it. But Ukraine can only end the war if it's no longer Ukraine.
What do you think the messaging is or was from China about nuclear weapons to Russia? And what do you think China is learning from this, specifically from the nuclear coercion side that we're witnessing from Russia at this point?
Well, I think China has restrained itself. In some ways, they have not turned fully their arms production online to help Russia. In some ways, they've restrained that. There are reports that China, in the media, in the Western media, that China has warned Russia behind closed doors not to use nuclear weapons. Okay. But China is a very dangerous factor in the war because of the supply lines that there's a report earlier this week that I saw inside Ukraine that China has opened one of its production lines for ammunition to Russia, and that could account for the recent surge in ammunition that the Ukrainians have seen showing up in the conflict. Now, if that's true, that's very dangerous. That would show that the Biden administration, despite its policy of engagement with Xi, has been counterproductive. And recently, a week ago, you saw reports of the Russians transporting ballistic missiles from Iran to Russia. Okay, and the Caspian Sea has certainly become an area, a part of this interior line of communication between Russia and Iran, has become allies, helping to offset Russian production deficits. North Korea has stepped in and done this. Now, your question is about nuclear weapons and about the role of China, but I'm painting a bigger picture here. The picture is of the area you know well, I know well, is Eurasia. It's a vast area where the United States is not exercising its full strategic capabilities, and in fact, some ways is siding with Armenia against Azerbaijan. And the U.S. actually used to have military cooperation agreement on non-proliferation with Azerbaijan, and it completely got rid of that. So because of that, the Russians can, with impunity, use the Caspian as its own internal lake to transport these Iranian ballistic missiles back and forth to help improve its own capabilities against Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Siberia, you have the Russians transporting North Korean ammunition and strategic ballistic missiles and whatever, most importantly, ammunition, and it's helping to offset their disadvantage in the war. Now, in a larger conflict between NATO and the West, this matters because the West doesn't have an effective means to interdict or stop this. So the essence of your question is that there's no strategy in Eurasia for this administration, and I don't even know if the future administration, whoever it is, will have that. But it's up for people like you and I to talk about this.
There is a fear that nuclear coercion and repeating the threats of nuclear use would eventually one day lead to some sort of use of nuclear weapons, at least a tactical nuclear weapon. First of all, do you agree with that? That's one part of the question. And the second part is, if the nuclear weapons were to be used, particularly by Russia and Ukraine, what impact or what would be the consequences of that use, in your view?
The problem in the United States now and in Europe is that there's very few Russian nuclear expertise available. And whatever expertise is available is not well known or understood in the high levels of the U.S. government. Nuclear policy and strategy has fallen to the wayside in the West. And so the ability to even interpret and understand what the Russian response policy would be is very limited. Now, there is some closed-door discussion on it, But the American audiences and experts in Washington don't know this area very well. Now, if Karaganov's article is correct, it means that the Russians, they themselves, haven't even worked out their own nuclear strategy. I mean, he is saying so openly in the Russian press. So to understand your opponent and how the Russians would respond and what they would do, you have to understand their mental mindset and their strategic writings on doctrine, nuclear doctrine in this case. You have to understand what it is. In the U.S. government and in policy circles, there's a very poor understanding of nuclear weapons strategy to begin with. During the Reagan administration, the height of the 80s, Democratic and Republican administrations, they understood what it was. They had a look at the writings on the topic, very vast and voluminous, but not now. You don't see occasionally there's articles in the U.S. media about the use of nuclear weapons and what their strategy would be. That's great. That's a great starting point, but it's very modest at best.